The entire kitchen fell silent. The moment the smoke-blackened door of La Maison Dorée swung open, and a man in a ruined chef's coat stumbled out onto the wet Montreal pavement. Food critics who had gathered for what was supposed to be the most anticipated restaurant reopening in Quebec that year, lowered their glasses. One pulled out his phone without saying a word. Another quietly shook his head, and the woman standing at the center of it all, Claudette Beaumont, the most feared restaurant reviewer in the country, adjusted her silk scarf, and turned to the gathered press, with the expression of someone confirming something they already knew. "Some kitchens," she said flatly, "are simply beyond saving." Nobody noticed the man who had been watching from across the street. He stood under the awning of a dry cleaner on Rue Saint-Denis, with a small boys asleep against his shoulder, both of them soaked through from the November rain. He watched the restaurant's front doors close. He watched the critics leave, and then, quietly, so quietly that no one could have possibly heard him, he said something to the sleeping child that would change both their lives within the year. "We're going to fix this, buddy, I promise." His name was Joel Tran. At 42 years old, he was the kind of man who repaired things people had already given up on. Not out of stubbornness, but because he genuinely could not understand why something worth saving should ever be abandoned. He had learned that lesson early. He'd spent the better part of his 20s cooking in some of the finest kitchens across Canada. From a small farm-to-table operation in Prince Edward Island, to a celebrated bistro on Vancouver's west side, that earned a national nod 2 years running. He was not flashy. He didn't plate food like architecture, or talk about technique the way some chefs did, as though they were performing surgery. Joel cooked the way his Vietnamese-Canadian grandmother had taught him. With patience, with care, and with the understanding that a meal was never just food. It was someone's memory, someone's comfort, the best version of a hard day finally ending. But dreams had a way of narrowing when life refused to cooperate. His wife, Pauline, had died 3 years earlier from an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. She was 38. Their son, Noah, had just turned 7 the week she was diagnosed, and by the time the illness took her, he was 8 years old and asking questions Joel still didn't know how to answer. The medical bills came fast and without apology. The small catering company Joel had built over 4 years of weekends and evenings dissolved within 6 months of Pauline's diagnosis. Clients drifted away when deadlines got missed, when Joel showed up distracted or not at all, when the business simply stopped being the thing he had most energy for. He didn't blame anyone for that. You can only pour from one cup at a time, and every drop he had went to Pauline, and then to Noah. When she was gone, Joel sold what he could, and moved back to Montreal, the city where he'd first learned to cook seriously, where he still had a sister, who could watch Noah in the mornings before school. He found work at a mid-range brasserie on Saint Laurent, doing lunch prep and weekend dinner service. It was honest work, it paid the rent on their small apartment in Rosemont. But every evening when Joel came home smelling of fryer oil and stock, he sat at the kitchen table while Noah did his homework, and he rebuilt menus in his head the way some men rebuild cars in garages. Quietly, obsessively, for no audience but himself. He never stopped thinking about the food he actually wanted to make. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in a glass-walled office on the 32nd floor of a building in the financial district, a woman named Sylvia Marchand was staring at a single sheet of paper that represented the worst decision she had made in 14 years of business. Sylvia was 51. She ran a private equity firm that had quietly backed some of the most successful food and hospitality ventures in the country: hotels in Halifax, a craft brewery group in Ontario, a small chain of upscale market halls across the prairies. She was methodical, controlled, and not given to sentiment. Her staff described her as someone who could read a balance sheet the way other people read novels, fast, completely, and without needing to go back. But the one thing she had allowed herself to be sentimental about was La Maison Dorée. The restaurant had been her father's. Henri Marchand opened it in 1987 in a narrow building in the Plateau Mont-Royal neighborhood that he'd bought cheap and renovated himself over 3 summers. He was not a trained chef, he was a man who loved feeding people and understood, intuitively, that a restaurant could be a kind of anchor for a community. La Maison Dorée became exactly that, a neighborhood institution, the place where couples got engaged, and families celebrated promotions, where the table by the window was always held for the elderly woman, who came alone every Thursday, and ordered the same duck confit without fail. Henri ran it for 22 years, until his health made it impossible, and then he handed it to a series of managers, who slowly, politely, ran the place into the ground. When Henri died 4 years ago, he left the building and the business to Sylvia. She had promised herself she would restore it. She poured money into a full renovation. She hired an award-winning executive chef, who lasted 11 months before creative differences ended the arrangement. She hired a second, who lasted 6. She brought in a consulting group from Toronto, who redesigned the menu 3 times and succeeded primarily in making the food feel like it belonged in an airport. The 4th executive chef quit without notice 2 days before La Maison Doré's much-publicized grand reopening, citing, and this detail made the rounds in Montreal's tight culinary community, an unresolvable disagreement about whether to serve bread. The press had been there for the grand reopening anyway, and what they witnessed was a kitchen in chaos, a dining room half filled with confused guests, and a front-of-house manager making decisions no front-of-house manager should ever be left to make. Claudette Beaumont published her verdict the next morning, 1,200 words that ended with a single sentence. La Maison Dorée has forgotten what it was always supposed to be. Sylvia read it at 6 in the morning, with a coffee she didn't taste. She sat with the review for a long time. Then she called her assistant and cancelled her morning meetings. Then she drove to the restaurant herself, let herself in through the side door, and sat alone in the empty dining room for almost an hour. She looked at the new lighting her consultants had chosen, too cold, too contemporary, nothing like the warm amber her father had always preferred. She looked at the menu, still printed on heavy cardstock at great expense, with dishes her father would not have recognized. And she felt something she was not accustomed to feeling in her professional life. Lost. It was Sylvia's assistant, who eventually heard about Joel Tran. Not from any formal channel. Not from a publicist or a restaurant association or a culinary school recommendation. She heard about him from her cousin, who had eaten at a private pop-up dinner Joel organized Sunday in a Rosemont community center. 30 seats, a handwritten menu, food that made her cousin describe it as, like someone cooked exactly what you needed before you knew you needed it. The assistant mentioned it offhandedly to Sylvia one afternoon. Sylvia looked him up. She found very little. A modest online presence, a few old reviews from his catering days, a mention in a PEI food blog from 8 years prior. Nothing that would impress the investors or the press. She called him anyway. Joel was between the lunch and dinner rush when his phone rang. He almost didn't answer. He listened to Sylvia explain the situation, La Maison Dorée, her father, the failed reopening, what she was hoping to find, and when she was finished he was quiet for a moment, not hesitating. Processing. "Can I come see the kitchen?" he asked. She said yes. He came on a Tuesday morning, before Noah's school drop-off, and he brought the boy with him, because there was no other option. Noah was 11 now, quiet and watchful, with his mother's eyes, and his father's habit of taking things apart to understand how they worked. He sat on a wooden stool near the pass, and watched his father move through the kitchen, the way you'd watch someone walk through a house they grew up in. Slowly, checking corners, running a hand along the surface of things. Joel spent 2 hours in that kitchen. He opened every drawer. He tasted the house stock, thin, under-seasoned, no depth. He read through the current menu 3 times. He went downstairs and looked at what was in storage. A set of copper pots that hadn't been used in years, a hand-crank pasta machine that still had flour dust on the handle, 2 cast-iron skillets, tucked behind a shelf of hotel pans. He brought the skillets upstairs and set them on the counter without saying anything. Sylvia watched him the entire time. "What do you think?" she finally asked. Joel looked around the room once more. Then he looked at Noah, who was reading a library book on his stool, entirely unconcerned. "I think your father knew what this place was supposed to feel like," Joel said. "The kitchen still remembers. Everything else just needs to catch up." Sylvia looked at him carefully. She had heard confident assessments from 4 other chefs. She had sat through presentations with slides. This was different. This felt less like a pitch and more like a diagnosis. She offered him the position that afternoon. The arrangement was unconventional. Joel was not a name in the industry. He had no Michelin mentions, no television credits, no profile in a national food magazine. What he had was a skill set that had gone almost entirely unwitnessed for 3 years, and a clarity of vision for what La Maison Dorée could be that came not from market research but from understanding, intuitively, what her father had been trying to build. Joel told Sylvia he would need 6 months. She gave him 4.5. He started the day after their agreement, arriving before 7, with Noah in tow, the boy doing homework on the same wooden stool, while Joel began dismantling the current menu from the ground up. He called suppliers he'd worked with a decade ago. He visited the Jean Talon market every Tuesday and Saturday morning. Noah beside him carrying a cloth bag. Both of them moving through the stalls with the easy familiarity of people who had been doing this together for years. Joel reintroduced dishes to the menu that were rooted in the honest, generous cooking of Quebec's culinary tradition, not in a museum piece way, not as nostalgia, but updated with the kind of layered technique that made familiar things taste more intensely like themselves. The duck confit came back, the onion soup came back, the bread came back, but he also brought in things nobody expected. A faux-inflected broth, served alongside a classic French cassoulet, not as a fusion experiment, but as a quiet nod to the fact that the city that had shaped him was shaped by 100 different kitchens. A dessert built around maple and condensed milk, that regulars later described as the kind of thing that made you feel, inexplicably, like calling your mother. The kitchen staff was small and, initially, skeptical. The sous chef, a woman in her late 30s named Harriet, who had survived all 4 previous executive chefs, watched Joel with the polite wariness of someone who has been promised things before. By the 3rd week, she stopped being wary. By the 2nd month, she was arriving early, and staying late without being asked, reworking her own station's mise en place based on conversations she and Joel had over staff meal. He doesn't yell, she told a friend later, with an expression of mild bewilderment. He just explains things until they make sense. Noah became, in his quiet way, a fixture of the place. He did his homework at the corner table after school. He knew which prep cook made the best staff meal, and had strong opinions about the bread service. Opinions Joel took seriously, because Noah had eaten enough good bread to have standing in the conversation. Some evenings Joel let him fold napkins in the dining room before service. And the boy did it with the same careful attention he gave everything. Folding each one precisely, while kitchen sounds drifted through the pass. They were not just rebuilding a restaurant. Both of them knew that, though neither said it directly. Meanwhile, word began to spread, not because anyone orchestrated it. In Montreal, food news travels through neighborhoods the way weather does, invisibly, until it's everywhere. A food photographer, who came in during soft opening, posted 3 images without comment that accumulated more attention than she expected. A retired sommelier who had known Henri Marchand mentioned La Maison Dorée at a dinner party in Outremont. A critic for a francophone lifestyle publication came in on a slow Wednesday night expecting to write a tepid follow-up piece, and sat at her table for 4 hours instead. Claudette Beaumont heard about it 3 different ways before she decided to go herself. She told no one. She booked under a name nobody would recognize and chose a Tuesday in February when restaurants either showed their real face or didn't bother. She came alone. She ordered without the server's guidance. She knew a menu well enough to read what a kitchen was actually capable of by what it chose to include. She ordered the onion soup. She ordered the cassoulet with the faux broth on the side. She ordered the maple dessert last. The dining room was about 2/3 full. The lighting was warm and unhurried. The table by the window was occupied by an elderly woman, eating duck confit alone, the same woman it turned out. Though Claudette did not know this yet, who had been coming every Thursday for 20 years, and had quietly wept the night of the failed reopening, when the dish wasn't on the menu. Claudette ate slowly. She took notes, she looked up more than she usually did. In the kitchen, Joel was running service the way he ran, everything. Without theater, without drama, with the focused calm of someone who had learned, over years of grief and recovery, to be completely present for the task in front of him. Harriet moved beside him with the precision of someone who had finally found the kitchen she'd been working toward. Noah was asleep in the corner booth by 9, one arm around a library book, a stack of perfectly folded napkins beside him. Joel didn't know Claudette Beaumont was there. He cooked the same way he always cooked. When she left, she paused at the door for a moment and looked back at the dining room. Then she walked out into the February cold and stood on the pavement for a long time before she went to her car. Her review ran the following Friday. It was not 1,200 words this time. It was 430, and every one of them was precise. She called the cassoulet a master class in restraint. She called the maple dessert the most quietly confident thing I've eaten in Montreal in a decade. She ended with a line that was reprinted in food publications from Vancouver to Halifax within 48 hours. La Maison Dorée has finally remembered what it was always supposed to be, and the man who gave it back its memory arrived without fanfare, without a publicist, and without, apparently, any interest in being noticed. The reservation line opened the following Monday morning. It was full within 3 hours, but it was what happened the following weekend that no one in the culinary world expected. Sylvia hosted a private dinner for a small group of investors, food journalists, and longtime supporters of the restaurant. She asked Joel to be present not as the chef. Service was in Harriet's hands that evening, but as someone she wanted to introduce properly. Joel came in a clean shirt and spent the first hour standing near the kitchen door, looking like a man who would have preferred to be cooking. Then Sylvia stood up. She said, without preamble, what had actually happened over the past 4.5 months. She described the 4 failed executive chefs. She described the failed reopening. She described the morning she sat alone in the dining room and felt her father's absence as a kind of weight. And she described the Tuesday when a man arrived with his son and spent 2 hours in a kitchen that, in his words, still remembered what it was supposed to be. When she finished, there was a quiet in the room that was different from polite attention. It was the kind of quiet that happens when a room full of people is recalibrating something. Then Sylvia said something no one present had anticipated. She was expanding La Maison Dorée, not with another location, not with a franchise arrangement, not with any of the strategies her investors had been suggesting for years. She was creating a new division of her hospitality group, one devoted specifically to restoring legacy restaurants that had lost their way. Properties with history, kitchens with memory, places that still had something to offer if someone was willing to see it. Joel would lead it. She called it the Marchand-Tran Foundation, and when she said the name aloud for the first time, she said it included Pauline's surname because, in Sylvia's words, every kitchen Joel builds carries her with him, whether or not her name is on the door. It should be on the door. The room was still for a long moment. Joel stood at the back near the kitchen door, and said nothing for long enough that a few people looked over to check on him. Noah, who had been allowed to stay for the dinner and was sitting at the corner table, with a glass of sparkling water and his library book, looked up at his father across the room. Joel met his eyes. Something passed between them that needed no translation. He had stood in the rain on Rue Saint-Denis 3 years earlier and made a promise to a sleeping child. He had meant it the way a drowning man means promises, desperately, with no clear idea of the current, and yet here he was, standing in the restaurant his hands had brought back to life, carrying a woman's name above the door of everything he would build next. There are people this world overlooks with such consistency that the oversight starts to feel like a verdict. A man cooking lunch prep on Saint Laurent while rebuilding menus in his head. A father folding napkins with his son in a dining room that doesn't know yet what it's about to become. The ones who don't pitch themselves, don't announce themselves, who simply show up and do the work and wait for the room to go quiet. Sometimes the room does. If you've ever felt like the thing you were capable of was invisible to everyone who mattered. Like your best was happening somewhere no one was watching. Tell us where you're watching from. Leave a comment below, and if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight.